Okay, get this. Today, we're going deep, really deep, into a historical event that, well, you might not have ever heard of.
A bit of a hidden shocker.
Yeah, it all went down in 1902 in Tuscumbia, Alabama. And at the heart of it, there's this guy, William Reynolds.
We're going to try to carefully, like piece by piece, put together what happened on that, well, on that pretty crazy April day.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So our main guide for this whole deep dive, it's going to be this Wikipedia entry for, Will Reynolds. And it cites all these old newspaper articles. It's amazing. We're talking firsthand accounts, right? From back then, like from the Richmond Planet, the New York Times, the Hartford Courant, and the Racine Journal.
Wow, so we're going way back, primary sources.
Right. And we'll also look at some pieces that came out later, reflections on this event, in the Times Daily local paper, and even the Montgomery Advertiser, the Indianapolis Journal.
So we've got a pretty wide range of perspectives here.
Yeah, I mean, our mission today is pretty straightforward. We want to get the facts straight, understand, what went down in this deadly shootout and the immediate aftermath. But only using what these sources tell us.
Sticking to the evidence, no speculation.
Exactly.
So.
Just a focused look at, this one intense moment in history using what we've got. So let's start by introducing the main player here, William Reynolds. What we know is he was an African-American man working for the railroad.
It seems he was born around 1867, so that would put him, let's see, like mid-30s during these events in 1902. And his job, he was a brakeman. Pretty important job on the trains back then.
And here's the thing that's really, really interesting. The records are clear, crystal clear, that William Reynolds had absolutely no, criminal history before that day.
That's a crucial detail. No prior convictions makes you think. I mean, what led to all of this?
So how this all kicked off, Fred? Law enforcement shows up at Reynolds' house in the black neighborhood of Tuscumbia.
And they were there, well, according to what we found, to arrest him. Seems he was charged with obtaining property under false pretenses.
We don't know exactly what property it was or the specifics of the charge, but that's why they were at his door.
Right. So we have the why they were there, but not the details behind it.
Yeah. And then the Richmond Planet, they describe what happens next, and it's intense. They say that Reynolds, he opens fire the moment the sheriff and a deputy are there at his door, and, well, he kills them both.
Right off the bat. So the first casualties, we have Sheriff Charles Gassaway and his brother, Deputy William Gassaway. So violent, so sudden, it immediately sets the stage for what's to come.
Yeah, I mean, you can picture it, right? The shock, the chaos. And after those initial shots, Reynolds, he barricades himself inside the house.
And the response, it was immediate. A posse was formed quickly, to deal with Reynolds holed up in his house.
It then turned into this huge gun battle. It lasted, get this, 4 hours.
4 hours? Just try to imagine that. A sustained firefight for that long. The tension, the fear.
I know. It must have been absolutely terrifying. And while they're exchanging fire, the sources say Reynolds, he kills 5 more men, 5 more white men from the posse.
So that brings the total to 7. 7 men dead by his hand that day. It's a shocking number.
It's hard to even comprehend. And to be clear, these weren't just random townspeople. They were law enforcement. We're talking Deputy Jesse Davis, Deputy James Payne, then there's Deputy Pat A. Prout, Deputy Bob Wallace, and then a man named Hugh Jones. It's hard to even grasp, the loss of life.
And, it's strange, right? This level of resistance, this level of violence from someone with no history of criminal behavior. What could have driven him to this point? What could have provoked such a powerful and ultimately tragic reaction?
It's the big question. And after 4 hours of this intense shootout, the posse, they decide, okay, we're going to set fire to the house to force him out.
And it's, as Reynolds is trying to escape the burning building, he's shot, he's killed. But, and this is a really disturbing detail. The sources say that the posse then threw his body back into the fire.
It's awful. It speaks to just the anger, the rage in that moment. It's chilling. And it wasn't just Reynolds' house. The Richmond Planet, they report that 3 houses total, burned down.
It's a scene of just utter devastation. And to put it in perspective, this event, it's the deadliest incident in the history of Alabama law enforcement. Think about that. The sheriff and 5 deputies from Colbert County all killed in this single event.
Wow, it's hard to even process.
Yeah.
And unsurprisingly, the aftermath was filled with racial tension.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just limited to Tuscumbia. There's this incident In nearby Florence, the day after the shootout, a white butcher, a well-known guy, he was arrested for killing a black patron who, get this, had spoken favorably about Reynolds.
Oh, wow. So even just expressing support for Reynolds could get you killed.
It's a clear example of how raw the emotions were and how this event it fueled the existing racial divide. And it's important to remember, amidst all this death, there were also people who were injured. We know of two men, James Finney and Bob Patterson, who were wounded during the gunfight.
Right. The impact goes way beyond those who died. The physical and emotional scars for the wounded and for the families involved. It must have been immense. Okay, so how did the newspapers cover all this?
Well, the New York Times, they had articles on April 7th and 8th, 1902. The headlines were like, "Desperado kills three," and then later, "Three died from wounds." So even they were struggling to keep up with the rising death toll.
And the Hartford Courant, they had coverage on April 8th as well. Their headline was, "Three of the Wounded Dead." Pretty somber. And the Racine Journal, same day, they ran with "Negro slays white men."
Yeah, you can really see the racial bias, the language of that time, right? Absolutely. And then later on, the local paper, the Times Daily, they revisited the event a few times. In 1958, there was an article that connected the tragedy to the death of the sheriff's wife. And then in 1971, on the 70th anniversary, they called it Colbert's Worst Tragedy. But then, as late as 1996, they had an article titled, "A Job Well Done."
A job well done. It's chilling, considering what we've learned. It really makes you think about how history can be, well, rewritten or reinterpreted.
It definitely highlights how narratives about historical events, they can change so much over time depending on who's telling the story. But we also have the Richmond Planet, remember, the African-American newspaper. They reported on April 12, 1902, and their headline was, well, completely different. "Attack on William Reynolds by Tuscumbia Sheriff Burns Two Houses."
Wow. So their focus is on Reynolds as the victim. They portray him as the one being attacked, which is a stark contrast to the desperado label we saw in other papers.
Right. It's a perfect example of why it's so important to consider multiple perspectives to get a fuller, more nuanced understanding of what really happened. And then there's the Montgomery Advertiser. They had an article on April 8th, 1902, titled "Desperado Kills Five." Again, with the desperado. And, the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial Fund, they officially recognize this event as one of the deadliest days in law enforcement history. It's a tragic, tragic milestone.
It is. And finally, the Indianapolis Journal from April 8th, 1902 had this headline, "Five dead and two dying." Just a stark reminder of the unfolding horror of that day. So to recap, we have William Reynolds, railroad worker, no criminal record, who, for reasons we can only speculate on, engaged in this deadly shootout, killing 7 law enforcement officers, ultimately losing his own life in a blaze of gunfire and fire. It remains the deadliest incident in Alabama law enforcement history, all unfolding against this backdrop of, well, the deeply ingrained racial tensions of the time.
And it's vital to remember as we close this deep dive that everything we've talked about, it's all based on what these historical sources tell us. These records are just a snapshot, a glimpse into this brutal, tragic event as it was understood then and as it's been reflected upon over the years.
It's limited, right? We only have these pieces. And with those limited details, the starkness of this event, it leaves us with so many questions. Questions for you, our listeners. What did this tell us about the historical context? About the human stories that are hidden within these accounts? It's a powerful reminder that history is complex. There's always more to uncover, always more to understand.